Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. There is no good reason for the work week to be 5 days long. It's not backed by science, ancient wisdom, or divine decree. Nobody sat down to conduct an objective analysis and determine that the optimal number of days for humanity to work and rest and that the current 5-2 split is right or fair or necessary. Instead, it was shaped by a rapid period of economic and technological change that concluded over a century ago. As we now undergo another period of rapid disruption, we are once again in the unique position to have the opportunity to reimagine the work week in a way that better suits today's realities and tomorrow's opportunities.
For 95% of human history, we worked an average of 15 hours a week. Doesn't that sound nice? That work was typically fluid, flexible, and quintessentially human. And then about 250 years ago, the Industrial Revolution changed work into something much more rigid and robotic. In the early industrial era, there were no evenings or weekends, no vacation days or sick leave. Those who showed up were paid for the hours that they worked, and those who didn't were replaced. Over time, workers started to push back. In 1817, a Welsh labor rights activist named Robert Owen introduced the idea of an 8-hour workday, but that didn't catch on for another 100 years. Around the same time, Christian groups in America successfully lobbied the American government to close the post office on Sundays so that their workers could attend church. Over time, Jewish workers asked for the same accommodation and were given Saturdays off to celebrate their Sabbath. But the Christians didn't like that anybody was working on Sunday, whether or not they were Christian, and so many employers settled on giving all workers both Saturday and Sunday off. That is how we ended up with the work week we have today. But that work week wasn't really adopted by any major employers until 1922, when Henry Ford became the first of the big American industrialists to start working on a 5-day shift of 40 hours per week. But he didn't make that policy permanent until 1926, which is less than 100 years ago. And it was still very controversial at the time. In fact, the American government didn't update its Fair Labor Standards Act to enact a 40-hour work week until the year 1940. But that's not the end of the story. In 1956, then Vice President Richard Nixon promised that a 4-day work week would be coming in the near future thanks to his administration's economic policies. Obviously, we're still waiting for that to happen. Just last year, independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders suggested amending the Fair Labor Standards Act once again to take the overtime to start after 32 hours instead of 40. And governments from Iceland to Japan to right here in Portugal have experimented with the 4-day work week. But if history is any guide, the political class is only going to amend the laws once it's been adopted by most private sector employers. That's where Joe comes in.
Back in 2018, I led a research project analyzing working hours within the Irish public service. And we discovered that many working parents, mostly women, had chosen to work a 4-day schedule with an equivalent reduction in salary. However, we also discovered that their job expectations, responsibilities, and the outcomes they were producing had not declined in kind. And that's when I learned of the concept Parkinson's Law, that a task expands to fill the time that's available for its completion. In other words, if you give someone 40 hours to complete a set of tasks, they'll get it done in 40. Challenge working parents to get the same amount done in 32, and they'll find a way to get it done. And in fact, we know, according to OECD data, that some of the most productive economies work the fewest hours and vice versa. Since 2019, I've been leading global pilot programs all over the world, from North America to Australasia and the UK to all over Europe. We have worked with hundreds of organizations of all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and we now have case studies involving tens of thousands of workers analyzed by reputable research institutions like Boston College and University of Cambridge that have shown that people can get more done in less time, and not only that, that this can also dramatically improve a range of different outcomes.
Since the Industrial Revolution, we have been measuring productivity in hours, which is a really effective tool for measuring output on an assembly line, less so in our modern knowledge economy. As I'm sure many of you know, there's a lot of ways to fill an hour at work. Not all of them necessarily contribute equally to the company's bottom line. As a freelance journalist, I'm actually not paid by the hour, I get paid by the word. So if I find new tools, technologies, and techniques to write more words in less time, I get paid more. But if I was paid by the hour, I'd be incentivized to take as long as I could on the work that I'm doing. And that's the reality for most workers today. If you do things slower, take more hours, and put in those hours after work or during your lunch breaks, you'll be praised for your commitment. But if you do things faster and more effectively, you'll be given more work to fill those hours that you've now saved the company. And that's often referred to as performance punishment. And it's probably been around for a really long time, but right now the challenges of overwork have become just too big to ignore. The Industrial Revolution kick-started a race towards hyper-productivity, but in our pursuit of efficiency, we lost the things that make work manageable, meaningful, and human. The pandemic was the first time that people really stopped to assess what matters in life and to demand a new relationship with work. Every year for the last 25 years, the recruitment company Randstad has surveyed workers around the world about their priorities, and last year was the first time that work-life balance outranked compensation. And we saw the same results in multiple studies all around the world, but especially among young workers who are demanding more meaningful, flexible, and sustainable work. Now, these challenges stem from the reality that the 5-day workweek was designed for an economy that no longer exists, at a time when less than 20% of women participated in the workforce, and work was very much limited to the place where you did that work. We now live in a world where most households require a dual income in order to make ends meet, and in what Microsoft describes as the infinite workday, where work is very rarely contained to the 9 to 5 hours. 996 and hardcore work culture is back in vogue in Silicon Valley. Meanwhile, a 2024 study by Mercer found that 82% of workers are at high risk of burnout due to excessive workload, exhaustion, and financial strain. Despite all the progress that's been made since the 5-day workweek became standard, workers are experiencing a more punishing relationship with work than their great-grandparents. Now, why is that? It's not because we're so desperately needed to do such important tasks for more hours of the day. Here you see the results of Asana's 2025 Anatomy of Work Index, which looks at how people spend their time every year. And it found that knowledge workers spend about 60% of their time on things that they describe as work about work. That's unnecessary meetings, duplicative tasks, and talking about work. As a result of all this time spent on things that don't actually improve the organization's performance, 88% of workers complain that they're falling behind on time-sensitive projects and major initiatives. Looking busy at work is getting in the way of accomplishing meaningful things at work.
In a famous episode of the hit TV sitcom Seinfeld, about 30 years ago, this gentleman, George Costanza, accidentally managed to lock his car keys in his car in the office car park. And his new boss showed up to work every morning at the crack of dawn because he was an early riser, and he saw George's car sitting in the office car park, and he thought, wow, Costanza is here early. And then late that evening, his new manager, who tended to burn the midnight oil and leave quite late, he also saw George's car in the car park, and he marveled at George's commitment and dedication to the job. So at the time that George was actually taking an unapproved vacation, his boss and his manager were thinking about giving him a promotion. And this story has a lot of parallels with the performative busyness that plagues the modern workplace. According to Atlassian, about 2/3 of knowledge workers think that it's more important to respond quickly to messages than it is to make progress on their top priorities. This productivity theater is creating a crisis of busy work that is both holding back organizational productivity and wearing down employee well-being. Despite all of the progress that we have experienced, we still often default to this outdated industrial age formula when it comes to measuring productivity, that is, output divided by hours. And this made a lot of sense in a world of assembly lines and standardized tasks, where consistency and predictability were key. But we now know that modern work does not have that same relationship between 1 unit hour of labor and output. And in fact, even the relationship between output and outcomes is much less direct. In other words, a report produced or a meeting attended by a knowledge worker may not have a very clear link with the results they're trying to achieve or the impact that they're trying to create. In other words, we have industrial metrics for the digital age, and we are long overdue a new definition of productivity that is better aligned with the way that people create value today. Modern productivity is not all about working long hours means better output. It is a much more complex, holistic equation that, yes, includes hard work, but also includes things like the quality of exercise, nutrition, sleep, time off, rest and recovery, and so many more things. In fact, there is a much greater correlation between employee well-being and performance than there is between hours worked and productivity in many modern workplaces. This shift has been underway for decades, but it will only continue to accelerate in the age of AI. Many leaders use the terms productivity and efficiency almost interchangeably. But efficiency is all about the speed and volume of tasks and processes. Now, in our fast approaching reality, where digital labor in the form of agentic AI can potentially, infinitely scale a repeatable process, for humans, racing against the machine when it comes to efficiency will be a dead end. And for leaders, trying to squeeze 1 to 2 extra percentage points of efficiency out of the human workforce will be a pointless endeavor. Efficiency will be the traits of our tools, whereas human value creation will shift to effectiveness. Things like creativity, judgment, adaptability, connection, critical thinking. These capabilities rely on leveraging things like employee motivation, recovery, well-being, and energy. And those same abilities can be optimized through a 4-day workweek, where we use AI not to do more things in less time, but to do fewer things better.
Prior to the pandemic, Unilever New Zealand was on an incredible run. The 70-person subsidiary of the global consumer packaged goods behemoth had experienced 16 quarters of consistent growth, making it the most successful regional market in the company. But the pandemic risked that streak coming to an end. Like many, their workers were exhausted, anxious, and struggling. When businesses are concerned about employee performance, they usually ask their people to do more. Unilever New Zealand did the opposite. In December of 2020, they began a trial of the 4-day workweek, asking their staff to deliver 100% results in 80% of the time. They introduced new tools and processes to help them accomplish that, cut back on meeting times, and underwent new employee training. As a result, they were able to reduce meeting time by 2.5 hours per employee per week, and reduced employee absenteeism by more than a third. Staff reported fewer work-life conflicts, less work-related stress, and more energy at work. When they polled clients, they reported 100% satisfaction. And during the 18-month trial, Unilever New Zealand added 6 more quarters of growth to their running streak. And then in 2022, Unilever expanded the policy to include their 600-person Australian team as well.
One morning in early 2022, Simon Ursel woke in a panic. The co-founder of UK-based environmental consultancy Tyler Grange had been working with his leadership team looking to find ways to improve employee performance and productivity. And he had heard of my 4-day workweek pilots, but he was afraid to raise such a bold and radical idea. That was until one night that he woke in a cold sweat with a nightmare, where his competitor had done this first and taken away his first mover advantage. Later that year, Tyler Grange launched a 4-day workweek trial and challenged their employees to find efficiencies, new tools, and new processes to improve performance. They experienced a 30% boost in productivity and improved recruitment and retention prior to making the 4-day workweek permanent.
There are stressful jobs, and then there's family law. Not only are the hours insane, but you're dealing with people at the most difficult moments of their entire lives. Throw in an unforgiving work culture, and it's no wonder that burnout, substance abuse, and suicide rates are far higher in that industry than on average. But when Lena Yousefi graduated from law school, she didn't care about any of that. She just wanted to be the very best. That was until a couple of years into her career working for a major law firm when she started suffering from debilitating migraines. That inspired her to quit her job and found her own firm, Y Law, in Vancouver, eventually moving to a 4-day schedule of 9 hours per day. And in that transition, she told her staff that they could reduce their billable hour requirements by 10%. Much to her surprise, attorneys continued to hit their old targets. Meanwhile, the firm was able to recruit some of the industry's top talent. And over the next 18 months, Ylaw doubled in size, becoming British Columbia's fastest growing law firm. Lena Yousefi wanted to be the very best. It just took her a few years to learn that sustaining peak performance requires less work time, not more.
Like many technology startups during the Great Resignation, Jay Goldman and Sensi Labs were not going to be able to compete with global superpowers playing by the same rules. They couldn't pay top dollar salaries like the Googles, Amazons, and Metas of this world, but they could offer something that they believed those companies never would, the four-day workweek. In doing so, they found that their teams didn't really understand the connection between the work that generated financial impact for the company and the work that didn't. The switch helped create much greater focus, clarity, and understanding on the work that really mattered within the company. They also took a creative approach to make sure that their clients could get served on a Friday where necessary. Every Friday, 3 of their customer support team checked in to make sure that there were no issues that required to be escalated prior to Monday, and 1 engineer needed to be within 10 minutes of a keyboard. Everyone else had the day off. 3 years on from this, Sensi Labs continue to attract and retain some of the best tech talent and have a very sharp focus on outcomes within their 4-day workweek model.
Now, these are just a handful of the hundreds of companies that have experimented with a 4-day workweek to address real business challenges. In 2022, Joe ran a pilot in the United Kingdom, after which 92% of the 61 participating companies maintained the 4-day schedule after the trial ended, after the majority reported equal or greater productivity. Later that same year, all 41 North American companies that participated in a trial kept the schedule after reporting average revenue increases of 15%. All told, 96% of companies that have tried a 4-day workweek trial have made the policy permanent.
But these results are not guaranteed. You can't just march into the office on a Monday morning and announce that you're switching to a 4-day workweek that coming Friday. The productivity gains that we've talked about are neither magic nor automatic. Much like remote and hybrid work models, the 4-day workweek requires thoughtful and intentional design. It calls for strategy, discipline, and a willingness to challenge everything that you thought you knew about productivity. It also needs to be seen by the workforce not as an extra vacation day or an entitlement or an expectation or a perk or a concession, but as a powerful, life-changing incentive to go about the difficult, challenging work redesign and tech adoption work that would otherwise be very, very difficult, using time as a shared reward for a collective mission to drive better outcomes and better performance.
And it's not just a powerful incentive. There's a lot of research out there to suggest that frequent restful breaks improves employee performance. The problem is that most workers don't get that opportunity. There was a study earlier this year which found that the majority of managers, by far, believe that staff who disconnect from work on weekends or vacations ultimately return more energized and more productive. However, those very same managers said the staff who disconnect during their time off are less committed and less promotable, in what the researchers call the detachment paradox. These managers aren't bad people, they've just been hardwired to see availability as a proxy for dedication, not unlike the factory owners of the 1920s or the baseball team owners of the late 90s, like George Costanza's boss. Changing this deeply ingrained mindset requires a big change, and we believe that's what the 4-day workweek delivers.
When Taylor Swift said on a podcast earlier this year that she treats her energy and attention like it's a luxury item, she demonstrated a business acumen that eludes a lot of modern CEOs that still treat the attention and energy of their teams as if it's an unlimited resource. We know from the organizational science that every time we get distracted, interrupted, or switch contexts, it takes us more than 23 minutes on average to get back to our optimal focus and flow state. But yet, we continue to pile on meetings, pings, tasks, and priorities. According to research, workers switch tasks every 300 times every day, and they switch applications and websites on average 1,200 times a day. This chaos and clutter of the modern workplace is in direct conflict with the conditions for sustainable human performance, creating a compounding tax on productivity through the workday. In other words, leaders who treat their people's energy in this way are just as reckless and as dumb as leaders who treat their company's money in a reckless fashion. The 5-day workweek started as a grassroots movement long before it was signed into law, and we believe that the same will be true for the 4-day workweek. Political efforts help to bring attention and credibility to the cause. But if history is any guide, change is much more likely to originate in Slack channels, academic research papers, break room chats, and on picket lines long before it reaches the boardroom or the legislative floor. When it comes to setting a new standard for the work week, history tells us that our leaders, our employers, and the employees will have much more of a role to play than our politicians. We don't have to choose between growth or balance, between ambition or well-being, between technology or humanity. One path can lead us to resentment, to resistance, and maybe to inevitable rebellion. The other path can lead us to engagement, to innovation, and to shared prosperity. We believe that in our age of AI, the 4-day workweek offers a concrete, achievable vision for the future that everyone can buy into.
Our book, Do More in 4, Why It's Time for a Shorter Workweek, will be published by Harvard Business Review Press on January 13th. You can pre-order by scanning the QR code on the screen. And we just want to say that online seller algorithms love pre-orders. If you want to see the 4-day workweek happen in our lifetimes or want to see the movement towards smarter, saner work go mainstream, your support would make a huge difference. If bulk order inquiries, please email booksales@hbr.org. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.